Let me encourage you to participate actively in the program. We are welcoming you as listeners, but we would sure love to hear from you on some of the issues that we'll be dealing with during the course of our program today. The phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. And my email address, if you'd like to send me an email directly, my email address is waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien 906, all one word, at gmail.com. I received an email based on yesterday's program from Betsy in Texas, and it was rich. It was absolutely a wonderful, wonderful resource that Betsy alerted me to. And it was so great that I wanted to share it with you. First of all, I want to thank Betsy for sending it and for tuning into the program and knowing too. But it was based on our program yesterday about giving and specifically about the idea of charity. And I had mentioned yesterday, and I mentioned to Betsy in my response to her this morning, that I was scheduled to deliver a program on giving at our local Rotary Club here at noon today, and I did that. That's one of the reasons that I'm a couple of minutes late. I had problems connecting. I got home at the last minute, and it was asking me for a password, and I couldn't remember it. It was 1 minute before we went on the air and all that. You know how that is. But anyway, I told Betsy that I appreciated her resource, and that if it was okay, I would use it in my Rotary presentation, and I would share with the entire audience this afternoon as to how it went, and share with you, everybody who's tuned in, what Betsy had sent me, which I think is fantastic. Let me tell you a little bit about the Rotary program today, because I think it was very special. As some of you know, and I think I've mentioned it, and Bob's probably mentioned it on his program as well, Bob Kincaid, but we are here in southern West Virginia since a week ago Monday. We've been hosting the Boy Scout Jamboree that has relocated into southern West Virginia from Virginia. It used to be south of Richmond at, I believe, Fort Hill, south of Richmond, off Interstate 95. I lived in Richmond for years, and I remember that the Boy Scout Jamboree used to be there. It was on a military base, on a National Guard base, I believe. And this particular site in West Virginia gave the Boy Scouts an opportunity to own their own site and build their own facilities and all that. And they have put tens of millions of dollars. We talked about this in the program, in a program earlier. But the fact of the matter is, since a week ago Monday, we started to bus Boy Scouts in from all over the country and outside the country. I know that one of the people I met today, two of the people I met today were hosting 150 Scouts in Puerto Rico. So we had quite a turnout. There were about 40,000 Scouts that attended the Jamboree. Tomorrow is the last day. The buses begin to pull out at 5 a.m. in the morning. So effectively, today is the final day of the Jamboree. And at our local Rotary Club here meeting today, we had a number of folks, Rotarians and others from other places, who joined us at the Rotary Club. And, of course, they were celebrating what has been apparently, we'll continue to read about it and hear about it in the media, I'm sure, a very, very successful Jamboree for the first year here at this site. I'm sure that they will learn some things from the experience. But from everything I can pick up, things went very, very well. As I mentioned yesterday, I believe, I volunteered on Saturday morning and spent a lot of time out there checking in guests and Scouts who had backpacks and all of that. But anyway, we had a number of visitors to our Rotary Club today from various places, 6 members from the Charleston, West Virginia Rotary Club, along with the 2 folks from Puerto Rico that I mentioned, and 3 or 4 other people. So we had a a wide range of people attending our Rotary Club today. And of course, as I mentioned, I was the program today, so I apologized for that because I think they came here thinking they're going to get a meal, and they got a half-hour program from me as well. But anyway, that takes us to what Betsy had sent me in an email. So I did want to share that with you. Basically, what Betsy's point was, and the resource that she sent me, was exposure, and for me it is exposure because I was unfamiliar with this, to the Jewish tradition of giving and charity. And she basically forwarded a website to me with a mention of a couple of books and resources and various other things, and introduced a couple of concepts in the Jewish tradition. And if I can, I'd like to share it with you because it just fit in so well with what I had planned for today, and it went over very well. And in fact, a number of the Rotarians expressed their appreciation for the information, and part of the information was Betsy's. So Betsy, I want to pass on their thank you as well as my own. Betsy introduced the idea of what is called tzedek, T-Z-E-D-E-K, tzedek, and a related concept from the same root, tzedakah, T-Z-E-D-A-K-A-H, tzedakah. Zetek, in Hebrew, is translated as justice. And the resource that Betsy sent points out that there are two approaches, two kinds of justice in the Hebrew tradition. There's that kind of justice which is called mishpat, M-I-S-H-P-A-T, mishpat. And then there is tzedek, which is another approach to justice. The difference, the email pointed out, is that mishpat is justice by the book. In other words, it's an approach to justice where you look at the behavior and you assess the penalty based on the behavior itself. Everything is straight up and up. It's based on the law. It's impersonal. In other words, you just basically apply the law to a particular offense, and that's the way you determine the punishment. Tzedek, on the other hand, is much more situational in its approach to justice. It's an approach to justice that is tailored principally to the particular circumstances of a particular situation. The term that we use, I've used this many times, and I'm sure you have as well, the term that we're familiar with is situational ethics. You know, there's what we call ethics, which is the whole idea of the right thing and the wrong thing to do. What's right and what's wrong. But then there's something which a lot of people take issue with called situational ethics. And the point of situational ethics is based on the idea that the interpretation of a particular event or a particular form of behavior or action is oftentimes evaluated based on the particular circumstances within which it happened. In other words, it deals with the issue of context. It's not just the application of the written law. So that's the difference in the Hebrew tradition between mishpat, which is justice by the book, and tzedek, which is situational justice. The point to keep in mind is that the idea of these two is very significant, because from the root of the word tzedek, which translates to justice, is the idea of tzedakah, T-Z-E-D-A-K-A-H. Tzedakah is translated into the word charity. And this, of course, gets to where we were in our program yesterday, and this is the point that I want to make. Tzedakah translates into charity, but it's not quite the same as most of us view charity. And this was I think, one of the more telling points in the presentation I gave, because it was one of the most telling points in the material that Betsy was kind enough to send me. Betsy points out that charity in the English tradition, in the Christian tradition, is based on the idea of the giver. It focuses principally on the giver, not the receiver of the charity. It's based on the idea that charity, as we regularly know it, principally comes from the heart of the individual. It's something which people give when their hearts move them to do so. That's quite a bit different than tzedakah in the Hebrew tradition. Because tzedakah, which comes from the same root as the idea of justice, in the Hebrew tradition is connected to the idea of justice. In other words, charity is not just the idea of doing good for somebody else. Tzedakah in the Hebrew tradition involves the responsibility to improve or help create justice, to take on the kinds of things which are a personal response to the situation of injustice in the world. In other words, the Hebrew tradition, the Hebrew approach of tzedakah, there's much more responsibility associated than charity. And the point that I was making in Rotary today is that so many people in today's world, and we can understand that. I'm not being critical. I'm just trying to make the point. And I tried to make this point today, that this is not a criticism. But many Rotarians, especially business people, professional people whose lives move fast and who are very busy, basically operate on the assumption that when there's a need that is demonstrated in the community or in society, their first inclination is to write a check. And the writing of a check is the idea of charity in the Christian tradition, in our tradition. But it is quite lacking when you look at the idea of charity from the Hebrew tradition. Because in the Hebrew tradition, writing a check is not even the beginning. The real issue here is committing yourself to doing something to relieve injustice in the world, to remove or help remove the circumstances which produced the need for some sort of charity or some sort of giving in the first place. So there's much more associated with tzedakah than the English view of charity. And one of the things that, one of the sources that Betsy made available to me is a particular study which includes 8 different levels of tzedakah, laws of gifts to the poor. It's kind of according to what the text says, it's kind of a classic formulation of the hierarchy of giving. Writing the checks would be level 1, for example. And there are 8 different levels. So it's very obvious that just merely writing a check or making a contribution doesn't even begin to scratch the surface as to what tzedakah is all about. I found that fascinating, that distinction between the the Christian tradition and the Hebrew tradition. And here's a quote, which from an author named Joel Westheimer, who this is out of the Journal of Jewish Life Network, and I found this quote to be particularly interesting and relevant. The Jewish requirement to help repair the world is often interpreted as a call for tzedakah, or charity. But a second critical aspect of Jewish tradition and experience is an emphasis on the need not only for compassion and charity, but also for justice, tzedek, for addressing the root causes of problems and inequities in society. And so there's a tremendous responsibility on the individual within the Jewish tradition to do something about the injustice that one sees. That has pretty much been removed from the Christian tradition. And for most of us, making a donation or a contribution or writing a check or pledging to a particular cause, to March of Dimes or polio or something like that, is oftentimes considered enough. I found, and the people in the audience today seem to respond equally with a lot of interest in this distinction, because it's an important one. And I think most people, in just the way they nodded their heads, tended to agree with my presentation was that my message to Rotary was that we've got to move beyond writing checks, and we've got to move beyond making financial donations or contributions to particular issues in our community. The difference between belonging to the Rotary Club, which is attending the meetings and sharing lunch and meeting people and networking and writing checks to solve problems. That's what belonging to a Rotary Club is about. But to be a Rotarian, in the real sense of the term, involves much more than that. It involves much more than writing checks. It literally speaks to the soul of what Rotary is all about, or an organization like Rotary or Kiwanis or the Lions Club or something like that. It is a commitment on the part of individuals to take on injustice and try to do something about it. And the point I made, which is the same point that I made on our edition yesterday of the Virtual Center, the point that I was making is there's so many things around us today which reveal a problem that really needs to be addressed. We need to begin to move in this direction. And I thought that Betsy's email was so appropriate, so timely, and fits so well into the message that I had planned to deliver anyway. It made the distinction very, very well. And it's very interesting because one of the members of our Rotary Club, a physician in the community, is Pakistani. And at the end of the meeting, he came up and was very, very appreciative of the fact, as he said, that I took on and agreed to talk about the soul of being a Rotarian. And he said, that is so necessary. This is, and anything less than that is merely superficial. It's what we looked at Emerson's essay on gifts yesterday. It's kind of a fairy token. It's not a real gift, but in a sense, it's almost an insult to the recipient. Because what you're doing is you're trying to make the problem go away with money, but you're really not doing anything to really. You're not really doing anything to really resolve the issue. And so, I want to thank Betsy for the email because it was so appropriate. And then I moved, and I'm not going to repeat the whole thing, but I have a couple of primary source material issues here that I want to share with you. Then I moved into the whole idea of John Locke, and we talked a little bit yesterday about Locke and the idea of money, and specifically the idea of charity within the English sense. And the point that I wanted to make is that in John Locke, not in the second treatise, it's very interesting because in the second treatise on civil government, John Locke does not address directly the issue of charity so much. But in the first essay on civil government, he focuses on charity in the very first chapter. And there's been a lot of controversy among scholars, and I'm not able to comment on this beyond just pointing it out. There's been a lot of controversy as to why Locke would take such pains to address the issue of charity in the first, the first essay on civil government, the treatise, but not the second. And in fact, one person has argued that even though they are called the first and the second, the fact of the matter is, his point is that the second, he believes, was written after the first. So, take that where you will. But the point that I wanted to make is that Locke made the point, which I made yesterday, and that is that man's property, when man applies his labor to a particular piece of property, it becomes his. That's what Locke calls man's natural rights to own property, to personal property. And what that means is the community at large does not have access to these rights because you've put your sweat equity into it and you have basically defined it as yours. And the general, remember, the dominant element that maintains order in the state of nature according to Locke is reason. And man's reason tells him that this makes perfect sense. But Locke's position is, as you read Locke, it's very clear that he believes that there is so much property, everything that man needs, everything that God made available to man for his sustenance is available in the state of nature, and there's enough there for everybody. And Locke's position is everybody is entitled to their own property and to the security of their own property. But Locke makes the point that you are not entitled to take more than you need or that you can use. And while he addresses that in his second treatise on civil government, in the first treatise he pursues that issue even more. And this is the quote from John Locke that I wanted to share with you today. Actually, there were two quotes, and I wanted to share them with you, but I think they're powerful. I think they speak not only to what I've spoken here, but issues that all of us are trying to resolve as we look at the society we live in and we look at some of the problems. So if you'll bear with me, let me read this particular excerpt from John Locke's first treatise on civil government. Locke says, "But we know God hath not left one man so to the mercy of another, that he may starve him if he please." We know. This is, remember Jefferson when he tapped into Locke's ideas. Jefferson in the Declaration referred to it as these truths being self-evident. Locke is basically saying the same thing. We know that God did not leave one man at the mercy of another so that the other might starve him if he pleased. That's not in the plan. That's not in God's plan, according to John Locke. God, Locke says, the Lord and Father of all, has given no one of his children such a property in his peculiar portion of the things of this world, but that he has given his needy brother a right to the surplusage of his goods. Let me repeat that because it's very important. God, the Lord and Father of all, has given no one of his children such a property in his particular portion of the things of this world, but that he has given his needy brother a right to the surplusage, the surplus of his goods, so that it cannot justly be denied him when his pressing wants call for it. And therefore, no man could ever have a just power over the life of another by right of property in land or possessions, since it would always be a sin in any man of a state to let his brother perish for want of affording him relief out of his plenty. The issue, I mentioned this yesterday, but I wanted to reinforce it because in this particular quote it's even clearer than it was in the passage that we read yesterday. What Locke is saying is that everybody is entitled to the commons. Man has a right to the property which he needs and can use and applies his labor to. Yes, that property is secure. But everyone has access to what's left. No man, Locke says, is given the kind of power that would deny anyone access to what he needs in order to maintain life itself. It would be a sin, Locke said, in any man of a state to let his brother perish for want of affording him relief out of his plenty. God's plenty. There's plenty there. There's plenty there for everybody to carve out what they want, what they're willing to work on, and what they need. There's plenty for everybody, and there's plenty left. I'm back to Locke. As justice gives every man a title to the product of his honest industry, and the fair acquisitions of his ancestor descended to him, so charity gives every man a title to so much out of another's plenty as will keep him from extreme want where he has no means to subsist otherwise. Charity gives every man a title to so much out of another's plenty as will keep him from extreme want where he has no means to subsist otherwise. Charity is not focused on the giver, it is focused on the person who needs. And the person who needs has a right to what he needs to survive. It is not contingent on the willingness or the goodwill of those with property to take care of those without. It is the right of everyone to have access to what is needed in order to survive. And a man can no more justly make use of another's necessity to force him to become his vassal by withholding that relief God required him to afford to the wants of his brother, than he that has more strength can seize upon a weaker, master him to his obedience, and with a dagger at his throat, offer him death or slavery. Nobody has a right to that kind of power over another human being, says John Locke. The issue here, and I go back to Betsy's email about the Hebrew tradition, the issue here of charity speaks to the right of the individual in need, not the person who controls the property. And part of what has been part of what's happened in the transition from Hebrew tradition to the Christian tradition is that charity has moved to the giver, and any sense of the right of the person in need has been taken away. The result is that what we have allowed to happen is that we have allowed the Christian tradition to conform to the needs of the free enterprise economic development society that we all live in, that our history is all about. The Christian approach to charity, it seems to me, the Christian approach to charity, I apologize for the phone in the background. The Christian approach to charity, it seems to me, shifts the issue of charity to the giver. And it makes it part of one's Christian duty to take care of his fellow man. And it removes any sense of obligation or any sense of right on the part of the person who needs. So in a sense, it feeds logically into the whole idea of some have, but many don't. And the many become dependent on the few. And that becomes part of the tradition of Western development, it seemed to me. And Christianity fits that perfectly. So it's ironic that when, especially conservatives, when people speak to the idea of America, of the United States of America as being a Christian nation founded on Christian principles, this is one of the Christian principles that we need to remind them of, because this is a key one. I think that quote from John Locke is just absolutely incredible. Let me share one other quote from Locke's first treatise. It's not quite as lengthy, but I think it's equally powerful. And this relates to the issue of private property and how much property people have a right to. And this is John Locke. He who gathered as much of the wild fruit, killed, caught, or tamed as many of the beasts as he could, by placing any of his labor on them, did thereby acquire a property in them. You have a right to what you grow. You have a right to what you pick. You have a right to what you catch. You have a right to what you kill. And the fact that you expended energy in doing that gives you a right, a property right in them. Back to Locke. But if they perished, they meaning the wild fruit and the game, but if they perished in his possession without their due use, if the fruits rotted or the venison putrefied before he could spend it, he offended against the common law of nature and was liable to be punished. He invaded his neighbor's share, for he had no right farther than his use called for any of them, and they might serve to afford him conveniences in life. You only have a right to what you need and can use. And if you take more than you need or more than you can use, and it rots, and in the process, others are forced to go without because you've taken more than you need, that, according to John Locke, is a violation of the common law of nature and is liable to be punished. Wow. Think of the significance of that. No wonder those who speak so fervently in support of the idea of Christian values and the idea of free enterprise capitalism and all of that. No wonder these particular elements in Locke are excluded from the discussion. This is an approach to charity and property rights and limitations that are very important. So as conservatives speak to the idea of the protection of private property and the natural rights, which is the basis of independence, of American independence, it is very important to realize that that concept has been manipulated and altered significantly in very, very important ways. Man's labor allows him exclusive ownership for whatever his efforts produce, and these cannot be confiscated from him. That's what government's responsibility to protect private property is all about. Because the title that he has in it can't be compromised at all. But the surplus part of his produce engenders the entitlement of the needy. And this is so strong that to invade your neighbor's share and take more than you need is to Locke a violation of the common law of nature and is punishable, makes the perpetrator of this liable. This is, I believe, very, very significant in our understanding of the Declaration of Independence and the whole idea of republicanism and Republican principles. There's a significant misinterpretation or reinterpretation of the sources. It is so ironic and so interesting that the Antonin Scalias and Clarence Thomases of the world are constantly talking about going back to the intent of the founders, going back to what the 18th century meaning of these terms was really about before we interpret our Constitution. What I'm trying to suggest, the whole rationale for the creation of a virtual center for the study of the Constitution is that when you go back to these sources, when you do what conservatives ask us to do, you find a whole world of meaning there that has been expunged and doesn't make it into our textbooks and doesn't make it into our schools and doesn't get into the framework of learning given our young people. Our young people know that a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense. It's incomplete. It's superficial. It's kind of self-serving in a lot of ways. Thinking, rational, logical, caring people can see through this stuff. And I think if pressed, many people would speculate that there must be more to it than we're being told, or that than the textbooks are covering. And my point is, darn it, there is. There's quite a bit more. And it seems to me that when you go back to the sources, when you live originalism as the Clarence Thomases and the Antonin Scalias and the Robert Borks have encouraged us to do for the last 30 and 40 years, when you do that, history has tremendous lessons to teach us that for reasons that have nothing to do with the founders, those lessons and those particular pieces of content have been expunged, reinterpreted, replaced, excluded, whited out, whatever you want to call it, from our past. And what many of these folks have done is rewrite the past in order to justify their agenda for the present and the future. They are not honestly interpreting history as history was written for us to understand and appreciate and learn from and go on. Rather, they are going back at the study of history from the perspective of cherry picking, finding the things that conform to the belief system and the priorities that they want, and citing those chapter and verse in order to make the point that the founders 250 years plus years ago were really laying the groundwork for what these folks wanted and what these folks believed that America, the American Republic, is all about and should be. John Locke and the founders who were so dependent on the writings of Locke and many of the others, and all the way back into the ancients, into the classic, the Roman Republic, and into the Greeks and into Plato and the rest of it. The founders were very, very knowledgeable and very, very aware of what republicanism was about. They knew what a society was about. They knew that in order to preserve society, you had to preserve all of it. The responsibility in the preamble to the Constitution, promoting the general welfare as one of the responsibilities, one of the missions, if you will, of the passage, the adoption of the Constitution of the United States. The role of government is to promote the general welfare. That means take steps and do what is necessary so that everyone can be successful. Not equally successful, obviously. We're not talking socialism here. We're not talking, some sort of utopianism at all. We're talking about the society we live in, but everybody is entitled to a chance. Everybody is entitled to an opportunity. That's the message. That's what we send out to the world. That's what brings the immigrants here. We have got to begin walking the walk as well as talking the talk. And I think this is incredibly important. And it begins with the whole idea of charity, the whole idea of giving. What a significant find it seems to me to recognize that in the Hebrew tradition, in the Jewish tradition, in the Old Testament, for example, in Deuteronomy, and Leviticus, there is constant reference in there to the idea that everybody has a responsibility to set aside a portion of what they grow or what they produce for the needs of others. It's there over and over and over again. And everybody who lives in society has rights, has certain rights, has access, has a right to access of these opportunities. And this idea that we have so skewed our political system that that a very small number, a shrinkingly small number, is acquiring more and more obscene amounts of wealth and property in our society, while more and more people are being required to scramble amongst themselves for what's left, is not the message. That's not the plan. That's not the American way. That's not the way the founders intended. That's not what the Republic was about. And I don't care how many times people say it is. If you go back to the sources and you go back to Locke and you go back to the founders, it is very clear that they knew. Jefferson in 1787, April, at a month before the Constitutional Convention met, Jefferson makes the point, man was destined for society. Man is not an individual who lives in a vacuum. Man was destined for society, Jefferson said. His morality, therefore, was to be formed to this object. How you determine a man's morality is measured by his role in society, not his role off by himself. Man was endowed with a sense of right and wrong merely relative to this, Jefferson said. Man has an innate sense, a conscience. Man knows right from wrong. That's what Locke based upon his whole idea of reason in the state of nature. That man knows right from wrong. It's logical. It's common sense. This sense is as much a part of his nature, Jefferson said, as the sense of hearing, seeing, feeling. It is the true foundation of morality, Jefferson said. The moral sense or conscience is as much a part of man as his leg or his arm. It is given to all human beings in a stronger or weaker degree. It may be strengthened by exercise, as may any particular limb of the body. You are not stuck with what you get. Human nature is part of it, but human nature is not all of it. And I don't care how many times you quote James Madison in Federalist Number 10 and Federalist 51 about human nature. Human nature is a certain way, but man and society is not condemned to live with what human nature is. The founders believed, Jefferson argued, that man's morality is already within him, and like his limbs, like his arms or his legs, it can be strengthened by exercise. This sense, and of course exercise is moral teaching. It's teaching good and bad. It's what education is about. This sense, Jefferson says, is submitted indeed in some degree to the guidance of reason. But it is a small stock which was required for this, even a less one than we call common sense. Reason's part of it, but Jefferson argues that a lot of it is innate within man. State a moral case. We talked about this quote yesterday. State a moral case. Reflection pause there, which is the time to cough. State a moral case to a plowman and a professor. Every time I read this, I think, and you might add after professor, and attorney. The former, the plowman, will decide it as well, and often better than the latter, because he's not been led astray by artificial rules. The whole idea of cognitive education, of instruction, is the idea of learning how to bend the rules, learning ways to get around it. If you imagine a circle, and this is difficult in audio, I know, but if you imagine a circle, and in the center of that circle is morality, is the good, then the question that all of us need to confront is, how much within man toward that center of that circle, how much of it is innate and how much of it is learned? And what we find with our system of laws and the acts of the role of attorneys in writing the laws, many of them for self-interested reasons, many people spend the bulk of their lives not in the center of that circle, but maneuvering around just inside the edge of that circle, trying desperately not to cross it. And if they've got the resources they need, they can hire attorneys and hire the advisors who can make sure that they don't cross that line and violate the law. But as long as they stay within the confines of that circle, they are, quote, okay, unquote. I'm struck by the big news in the sports world in the last 24 hours is obviously the Ryan Braun situation with the Milwaukee Brewers. And I don't know about you. I'm a baseball fan. I have to admit that. One of the things I've always said over and over again through the years is, in spite of some of the horrible things that individuals have done to try to destroy this game, the fact of the matter is the game is stronger than any of them. The game prevails, and it's still a wonderful game. And it's something that children, young boys aspire to, and they get excited about, and they want a glove, and they want a bat, and they want a cap, and they want a jersey, and they want to go to the ball game, and they want to catch a foul ball, and they want to sing Take Me Out to the Ball Game. And in Boston, they want to sing Sweet Caroline, and all of these things that are so much of the tradition around baseball. The game is strong. It's a wonderful game. I believe that. I'm kind of revealing myself here a little bit. But over the last 24 hours, I've been wounded. My affection for baseball has been wounded by the Ryan Braun situation. And the reason is not because of just because of what happened, but it goes back to a year ago when on a technicality he was able to beat the allegations, the charges against him. And over again, more than 3 or 4 times today, I've heard rebroadcast of the press conference in which he responded the last time around in saying, I didn't do this. On the grave of everybody and everything that is important and holy and valuable to me, I swear I didn't do this. And then yesterday, when the charges were brought, the same person says that he willingly accepts the penalty now that he's got his $120 million contract over the next 8 years. So he's going to lose about 5% in the 65 games that he's going to sacrifice this year. He's going to lose about 5% of that total of a $120 million contract. And he said, none of us are perfect. I've made mistakes. Quite a bit different than what he said 6 or 8 months ago, however long it was. I'm personally wounded. I think the game is wounded. This is the world we live in. And so many people spend their lives not trying to get toward the center of that circle in which is morality, but trying to manipulate and maneuver around the edges without going over the line. And so many people don't make it. And it almost becomes a game. And as many of you know, it's a game today where it almost seems like if you apologize and you do it in a way that gets people to believe you, then it's okay. Your sins are forgiven. And yet there are so many people that devote their lives, that dedicate their lives toward reaching the center of that circle, not trying to maintain existence near the outer edge. And I would suggest to you that's the emphasis on our legal profession and on our laws and the rest of it. That's where all the action happens, on the edge, not in the center. The difference is we've got to start aiming for the center. We have to. Because we are seeing things happen in our society. We are beginning to see the price that we as a society, and I don't mean just the United States of America here, I'm talking about the West generally, many of the developed nations. we are beginning to see the end product of, we are beginning to reap much of what we've sown. Many of us are are looking at the possibility or the prospect of losing their retirement, of losing their health benefits. And I'm not gonna go into all of this right now because I don't think our program warrants it at this point. But it is very important to keep this in mind. I mean, if you believe, as I do, that what John Locke and what the founders talked about was making sure that everyone had a shot, everyone had a chance. And if you believe that quality health care, education, good, acceptable housing, a job, if you believe those necessities of life in the modern world are things that everybody is entitled to, then it seems to me we have to deal with the question, what are we doing? What do we think we're doing? Think about the Affordable Health Care Act. I'm not going to get into the details of it at this point. It's a little bit off the mark. But the fact of the matter is, the health care law was written not with the intent of delivering quality health care to citizens, but in providing access to citizens to the kind of insurance which enables them to purchase health care. Health care somehow is transposed in this whole equation from something that everybody ought to have a right to a commodity that only certain people can buy. And the intent of the Affordable Care Act is to expand the number of people who can buy it. It's not to make it readily available to everybody. Think about that. Think about what we are doing. We are building into the process an entity, insurance, a profit motive, which stands in the way between health care on the one hand and the needs of citizens on the other. So the question is the purchase of insurance to buy health care, is that really the same thing as health care? I would suggest it is not. And I would suggest all of us need to address that. Education. We are seeing education, abysmal results in education. In higher education, we are seeing the benefits that many of us began to see happening after World War II with the VA and all these programs, the GI Bill and all of these other things, which were designed to give people access to education because education was the ticket to opportunity in America. Now, more and more, education is becoming the prerogative of the well-heeled. The costs of higher education continue to go up and up and up as states and municipalities begin to reduce their contributions to education in deference to what is called fiscal austerity. We are basically operating on the assumption that balancing budgets, rather than taking care of our own people, somehow has become the priority. We have to address it. We have to see it for exactly what it is. And we have got to begin to make the case that this is not the way we want it to be. And the thing that has driven me here at the Virtual Center is the extent to which people go back to the founders and try to use them in ways which justify the worldview that these people are in the process of designing and promoting. And when you read the founders, and I don't mean me, and I don't mean you, I mean our young people, when we talk about educating citizens in a republic, we are talking about citizenship. We are talking about civic responsibility. We are talking about the public good. We are talking about the health and welfare of our fellow citizens. We're talking about opportunities. We're not talking about all these tangential and side issues like nationality and religion and color and race and accent and all of these other things that we use as excuses to not deliver on the promise of America. The promise of America is what America is about. That's what the founders were about. That's what this virtual center is about. That's what research will bring us. And if we can be honest and go back and actually honestly delve into the ideas and the thinking and the sources left us by the founders, if we all set out working together to try to create the ideal society that the founders really believed independence would bring us, we can do it. We can do anything that we set to do. But there's so much politics and political one-upsmanship and all the rest of it that goes into this and diverts and separates and divides and all the rest of it. We started this discussion a few days ago talking about labor and the organizations, the divisions within labor, and how ultimately it seems like everybody's losing because of it. Now we're looking at one of our major cities filing for bankruptcy. We are looking at the possibility that may not be the only one. That happens to be the same city that the auto industry has rebounded in. But it's not enough to offset the $18 billion in debt and obligations that the city of Detroit seems to face and doesn't seem to be able to find ways around. This could happen to many other municipalities. Many state governments are operating at a deficit. How do they deal with that? They begin to cut back on services to citizens, when in fact the whole idea from the beginning is the welfare of the citizens, not the rights of those at the top, but the welfare and benefits of everybody. We seem to have lost that message. We need to recover it. It is the top of the hour. We have reached the end of our first hour together. I didn't really anticipate that we would spend the entire hour on this, since we spent quite a bit of time on it yesterday, but it's one of those things that the further you go, and once you get into the sources, once you begin to read John Locke and you begin to read Jefferson and some of these other people, and you begin to really understand what's in their heads and the kinds of questions that they are wrestling with, you begin to appreciate that, like us, these are people, human beings, just trying to figure it out. They're not sending messages to people. They are struggling, as are all of us, to try to figure out how it all fits and how it all works for the benefit of all of us. That's what it's about, and if we all set our minds to work together with that as our objective, we can do it. We can fulfill the potential and the greatness of what people refer to as American exceptionalism. But it is not a process we have reached, Mitt Romney notwithstanding. It is a work in progress, and it is one that all of us need to get back to the basics and begin to pursue. Let's pause and take 3, 4, 5-minute break, and it's 2 minutes after the hour. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. If you have a comment, if you have something that you would like to throw into the pot and share with our listeners, with our audience, by all means, we invite you to do so. When we come back, before we start our second hour, it's a perfect time to have your voice heard and your ideas considered. The phone number, area code 304-658-3333. We'll take a 4 or 5 minute break, and we'll be back. This is Bill O'Brien. Stay in there with us. This is Bill O'Brien back with you for our second hour on today's edition of the Virtual Center. If you are just joining us, welcome to the program. If you have been with us since we began a little bit better than an hour ago, I want to thank you personally for staying with us, and I invite you to share your ideas and your comments with our audience, because I think everybody would enjoy hearing your thoughts on some of this. I know that I would, but I'm kind of this, at the back of the line here. The people who have taken the time to tune in to the Head On Radio Network and sit there and digest this program. One of the things that I got today, one of the people in the Rotary Club, when I made my presentation at noon, at the end of the program came up, and my God, he said, that's painful. I haven't done that much thinking in a long time. I was only about a 25-minute presentation. And, I haven't done that much thinking in a long time. My head hurts, something like that. And some of the stuff is heavy, and I realize that. I just think it's so very, very important, and that's the reason that I'm so excited about the Virtual Center and about the potential and the prospects of the Virtual Center and what it might lead to in the long run, hopefully. Again, our phone number, area code 304-658-3333. We would love to hear from you. If you would like to email me directly, my email address is waobrien906, all one word, @gmail.com. waobrien906 @gmail.com. I wanted to share another email that I received, and this is kind of an aside, but I think it's a very, very significant issue, and I really I'm not able to put to tie it up and file it away as if it was done, because I don't mean to do that. But I've received a couple of emails from listeners who have talked about, as many people talk about. It's one of the hot topics in our society today is the whole idea of the Second Amendment and the origins of the Second Amendment, and what the Second Amendment is really all about, what led to it, and why the United States of America is in the minority in terms of other nations who did not feel the need to incorporate something like the Second Amendment into their constitutions and their frames of government, but we did. And I know that there are some programs and some commentators who are making the point, and I know I've had this discussion with a number of folks in emails and in conversations. There are a number of folks who relate the origins of the Second Amendment to the issue of arming militias in the South in order to control or prevent slave revolts and hunt down escaped slaves. And, the idea being that the Second Amendment really doesn't say what the founders at the constitutional, in Congress knew that it meant when they included the Second Amendment among the amendments added to the Constitution in 1791. The idea of a well-regulated militia being so necessary, the right to bear arms shall not be violated, and the idea being that there's a whole background to that in terms of the need to hunt down slaves, and I've read a couple of articles where people have pointed out that certain southern states, Georgia being the one that comes to mind right away, had laws which required every male at a certain age to serve in the militia, and part of the responsibility was to participate in these patrols that would reinforce the slave system. And so there's a tendency on the part of many people to associate the Second Amendment with the idea of slavery and the idea that this was part of what the South demanded in order to go along with some of the other aspects that were happening in Congress in 1791 in the first Congress. And that Madison found it necessary to incorporate this in order to appease the pro-slavery interests in the South. A lot of it, I've read, and I know that there are books that speak to this. Yesterday, I emailed a good friend whom I hope will have on future programming for the Virtual Center, John Kaminsky at the University of Wisconsin. John is the editor. He's now officially retired, but he's still working, obviously, on editing the ratification papers for the Constitution of the United States. And I asked him this question, and I said, John, because John has been at this more than close to 40 years, and he is sitting on top of all the resources and all the research that people can get their hands on related to ratification of the Constitution. And from my perspective, there's nobody walking the face of the earth right now that knows more about the Constitution and ratification of the Constitution in the United States than John Kaminsky. He is the editor of what thus far is in excess of 20 volumes on ratification papers. So he's read it all, and he's editing them and making sure that the transcripts written in longhand conform to the typed versions of these and all the rest of it. The punctuation, everything remains the same. And they hire proofreaders who do this before they incorporate this stuff into the final volumes for publication. And as I mentioned, Pauline Meyer's book on ratification, which came out at the end of 2010, in October of 2010, was based on the resources available through this project. And what she mentions in her preface is that on the ratification story for the states that were already completed in this ratification project, the Kaminsky Project, her chapters on ratification are strong. But she was apologizing for the chapters that, where the ratification project has not yet made available all the resources that exist. And so her book came out before the project was completed, because the project has been going on. Merrill Jensen, before he died in 1980, Merrill Jensen was first editor of the project, and then when he passed away, it was the baton was passed to John Kaminsky. I asked John Kaminsky about this issue of the Second Amendment, because he's read it all. He's seen all the resources. He's looked at all the research. He sits on top of file cabinet after file cabinet of 18th century resources. And John told me in an email that I received from him that he hasn't really found evidence that this is really what the Second Amendment is all about. He mentioned that there's a lot of evidence that anti-federalists in the North, opponents of the Constitution, charged as part of their anti-Constitution campaign that if the Constitution was ratified as it is, then Northerners would be expected to serve in military operations which would in part be designed to hunt down runaway slaves. That was part of the anti-federalist challenge to the legitimacy and the honesty of the Constitution of the United States. And John points out that there are a number of Federalist responses from the South to this, denying this. But he hasn't seen specific evidence connecting the Second Amendment to this issue. He pointed out that, he said, I know that there are books and commentators who are speaking to this. And I think what they've probably done, as so often happens, is they've been inclined to read more into the sources than the sources actually contain. Because they believe this, and they tend to read into it what they want to see there. And I think this is one of the issues that all of us need to confront when we're dealing with history. You can't put words into the source's mouth. In other words, you've got to basically take verbatim what the author says. And you can't say, well, he said this, but he obviously means more. You can't do that. So John's sense is that a lot of this is is extension, is an effort to extend the meaning of the sources. That's his spin. The reason I mention this, because I can't put it together, I don't know, but I will say that John Kaminsky's view on the subject is a point of view that I take very, very seriously, because nobody knows more about what's out there than John does. And at this point, he's not found anything to confirm this effort that the Second Amendment is linked directly to armed militias for the purposes of hunting down and preventing slave revolt. And John did point out, I will mention this for what it's worth, but he's pointing out that right now his project is working on ratification in Maryland, and they anticipate that the Maryland chapter will be completed by the end of the year. And, of course, he pointed out that part of their resources is a dissertation that was written on ratification in Maryland. Of course, it was mine. I wrote my dissertation in 1979. I received my degree in 79. And my dissertation was 650-some-odd pages on ratification in Maryland. And as John points out, they're using my dissertation as the overall context for the decisions they make on which sources to publish during the editing of the primary source materials that will go into the ratification project related to Maryland. Maryland is one of the states that is just now being completed. They're just working on it now. And so John thought that I'd be interested to know that everybody out there is reading my dissertation. Probably nobody's read it since it was written in 1979. But anyway, I wanted to share with you John's thinking on the Second Amendment, because I think that's very, very important. And I think we do have to be careful to not read more into the sources than is there. The point that I was making is unfortunately, that's what many people have done with John Locke and the founders and Jefferson and the rest of it. Prominent, competent historians are human beings. We're all human beings, and we all have our druthers. And, of course, as historians on this particular period, many of these people have been through many of the sources, and they know the sources. They know, basically, they have formulated their own hypothesis, their own approach, their own ideas as to how things happened the way they happened, why they happened that way, etc. And, of course, the more proficient and the more familiar with the resources they become, then many times the more dogmatic they become in their particular interpretation. And there is a tendency, because we're all human, to read more into some of the sources than is there, because we are so sure that that the meaning we are trying to assign to these sources is indeed valid. And I think that's something that all of us need to take care of, because basically, in fact, in our first hour today, in talking about John Locke, that was one of the points I made, that those people who set out to basically argue that the founders were in the Constitution, the ingredients of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, as well as the interpretations of the Constitution that come out of the Supreme Court. What was going on during this period was the laying of the groundwork for what is going to become free enterprise, capitalist society. In other words, that the founders were really budding entrepreneurs. And the system they laid out was laid out with the idea that they were setting up a system for economic development according to the tenets of free enterprise. In other words, that's what people want to believe the founders were doing. And so they go back into the sources, and sure enough, they can find if they cherry pick properly, they can find all sorts of evidence to support that. I can't deny it. I can't refute it. But what I can say is that oftentimes they are guilty, these folks are guilty of reading more into the sources than the founders put there. And I think that's very, very significant. We're at 22 minutes after the hour, and I wanted to return to another issue. We've talked about, we were talking about co-determination, and we were talking about the relationships between labor and management. I remember a few days ago we were talking about the National Labor Relations Board and the political controversy over President Obama's appointments to that board and the compromise that was reached last week in the United States Senate in order to sustain the filibuster. Now, given what the Republican Party in Congress, and especially the Senate, has been able to do under the leadership of Mitch McConnell since President Obama was first elected in the fall, in November of 2008, and given the use that Republicans have made of the filibuster to effectively stymie the Congress of the United States and keep meaningful legislation from going through, one would think that the number one priority of the opposition of the Democratic Party, the majority in the United States Senate, under the leadership of the president of the Senate, one would think that the priority would be to find a way to do something about the filibuster. But the fact of the matter is, Senator Reid is as committed to the rules of the Senate as is Mitch McConnell. And so what we're talking about here are the rules of the game that all of these people have agreed to work by. And so as stymied as the Democratic majority in the Senate has been for the last 5.5 years of the Obama administrations, with the Republican reliance on the filibuster in order to stymie legislation coming out of the White House and out of the Obama agenda, the fact of the matter is, when push came to shove and the issue of the filibuster itself was on the table, the so-called nuclear option, the reason it's called that is because the issue was so explosive in the day-to-day operations of the United States Senate. A compromise last week was reached to make some of these appointments in order to not destroy the filibuster as an option, as a minority option in the United States Senate. And John McCain of Arizona was one of the Republicans that was most instrumental in negotiating that particular compromise. But again, the compromise was designed principally to sustain the filibuster. As frustrated as the Democratic majority in the Senate has been with Republican tactics and reliance on the filibuster, that frustration did not translate into a desire to obliterate the use of the filibuster. And I think that's very, very significant. So anyway, we've been talking about that. We talked in previous, 3 or 4 weeks ago about the wonderful email that we received from Sweden from Scott about the differences between the Swedish social democratic political system that's underway there and comparing it with the Constitution. And if you remember, Scott made the point that in many ways these Northern and Western European societies have moved beyond the Constitution to our Constitution, to the point that the efforts of American foreign policy to clone our system would, for many of these European states and Scandinavian states, amount to a step backward in terms of the progress. They've gone way beyond where American constitutionalists are willing to go in terms. And one of the areas we were focusing on is the area of organized labor. And the quote from Wikipedia that I shared, which is that while many countries like Germany and Sweden have bought into the concept of co-determination, the idea that labor has a right and a responsibility to sit at the table and to be directly involved in decisions affecting organized labor and production and the delivery of services in these societies. That respect for the wisdom and the contribution of labor in the United States has never existed. And from the very beginning, management and labor in the United States seemingly have been hostile to each other. And so one of the benefits, it seems to me, of studying American history is to go back to the origins of the Industrial Revolution in America, to look at industrialism as it first began to surface in the United States in the late 18th and early 19th century. And one of the historians of the founding period that does this so very well is a very, very reputable historian who retired recently from UCLA, Joyce Appleby. And she's written a number of books on the history of capitalism. The book that I'm thinking about specifically is called Inheriting the Revolution. And I think I've mentioned this before. And what she does in her book, Inheriting the Revolution, is look not so much at the founding generation of the 1770s and 1780s, but look at the generation that came immediately after that, those that were still young in their teens and 20s and 30s in the 1790s and in the early 19th century during the administration of Thomas Jefferson. And Joyce Appleby is one of the people that has seen the origins of capitalism as it unfolds with the Industrial Revolution in America. She has seen the roots of it in the late 18th and early 19th century in the so-called New Nationalism period, which is the period after ratification of the Constitution under the administrations of George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, and indeed James Madison. That's why the cutoff point for many of these courses in colleges and universities is 1815, the end of the War of 1812. The assumption is that from the end of the War of 1812 in 1815, the Treaty of Ghent, which ends the war, that from that point on, American history seems to point toward what is going to become the separation of the Union and the effort of the South to secede from the Union, and ultimately the Civil War that ensues as a result of that. So Joyce Appleby is one of the nation's most prominent historians of this period. She's one of the people that sees, in looking at the first generation, those who inherited the revolution, and that's the title of her book. She looks at them in the entrepreneurial spirit that seems to drive America in the Northeast into the West and in the Middle Colonies, and even in the South with the expansion of the slave system. It's a wonderful study. It's quite profound and quite perceptive, and well worth reading. One of the areas that I've been for a long time particularly interested in, I've always been very interested in labor history in America. I think part of the reason is because I grew up in a union family. My dad was a union member throughout all of his working years. And I grew up in that kind of an environment, in a working class environment in Boston, and very, very pro-union environment. And so I've always, when I began to study American history, seriously study it, I was very, very interested from the very beginning in labor history in America. The origins of the American Federation of Labor and the role of Samuel Gompers and the idea of the Knights of Labor and the International Workers of the World, the so-called Wobblies. I remember in graduate school, in fact, in a course taught by Stanley Cutler, interestingly enough, a constitutional course, I took on for my research project the Clayton Act of 1914, which was passed during the administration of Woodrow Wilson, which at the time it was passed, Gompers defined it as labor's Magna Carta, that Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats in Congress, with the passage of the Clayton Act in 1914, in the eyes of many people, legitimized the right to collective bargaining in America, and many laboring people, many working people saw the Clayton Act of 1914 as labor's Magna Carta in America. And I did some primary research on the Clayton Act in a graduate research paper that I wrote for Stanley Cutler many, many years ago. It was in the 1960, about 1968, actually, I did that paper. And one of the things I found in my research, and I'm drawing on memory here from a long, long time ago, so please bear with me. I didn't anticipate before today's program that I would be going into the Clayton Act in any depth. But as I remember, one of the things that I found in my research was that despite labor's reliance on the Clayton Act as being its Magna Carta, the fact of the matter is much of the verbiage, the language of the Clayton Act was vague and imprecise and inconclusive. In fact, one of the conclusions that I reached in my paper, in my research, was that the Clayton Act was a classic example of political chicanery. It seemed to say things that it really didn't say. It, in effect, contained a number of outs or options where it seemed to be a statement of principle in labor's favor, but the fact of the matter is there were caveats and elements built into the language that left all of these things open to interpretation. And it became very clear to me that a conservative Supreme Court, once it was asked to interpret the constitutionality of specific provisions of the Clayton Act, a conservative pro-business Supreme Court would be able to find all sorts of opportunities within the language of the Clayton Act to deny and remove rights that labor thought the Clayton Act had given them. In a sense, my conclusion was that the Clayton Act was, on the surface, it appeared to be a major victory for organized labor in America, but in fact, it was extremely duplicitous on the part of Congress. And what Congress had done is reach a series of compromises on key provisions of the Clayton Act, which actually rendered the final decision in the hands of the Supreme Court to come when the issue ended up before the court. In other words, Congress had kicked the can down the road and not made definitive decisions on some of these major issues. And so much of the positive labor response to the Clayton Act was the result of labor wanting to see things in the Clayton Act that really weren't there. And they believed that the Clayton Act gave them a lot more than it ended up giving them. And by the time you get into the 1920s and the administration of Warren G. Harding and Coolidge, under the Chief Justice William Howard Taft, you had a very pro-business, conservative, anti-labor, anti-union Supreme Court. And once the provisions of the Clayton Act ended up on the table before that court, it was very obvious that much of the victory that labor thought it had won in 1914 prior to World War I were really not victories at all. And much of this was left in shambles in the 1920s and awaited what became the Roosevelt administration and the New Deal to basically create the kind of legislation which Roosevelt and the Democratic Congress did in 1935 to restore many of the rights that labor thought they had been given in the Clayton Act, but actually were not there. Many of them were directly attributable to the New Deal administration of FDR. And that's basically from, what I can remember about the research that I did on the Clayton Act. But again, as I mentioned, I've from the very beginning, I was always very interested in labor history. One of the things that impressed me very much, and I think part of the reason is because I grew up in New England, and in the process of traveling around, I saw many of the former textile mills that used to basically drive the New England economy in the 19th century. And many of these mills, of course, are closed down now. Some of them have been restored and converted into malls, into outlet malls of various kinds. And I've gone shopping when I go up and visit family in New England. We visited a number of these former mills. My brother lives in the town of Milford, which is about 50 miles southwest of Boston. And the adjoining town to Milford is a small town in Massachusetts called Hopedale. And it's an absolutely delightful New England town, an absolutely beautiful town. And when I visit up there, we always like to go to Hopedale. It's just beautiful. But part of it is that the town is dominated by the mills that have been shut down, and the houses, the homes that many of the people that worked in the mills lived in, and so the town is delightful. The mill is obviously not operative, and there are portions of it that have been rented out and converted into something else. But the fact of the matter is the mills are gone. Many of those mills went into the South, into the Carolinas, and then were transposed into Latin America and overseas and various other places for purposes of labor costs, which we've mentioned already. But one of the things that I've found very, very interesting in my studies, in my reading, is the origins of industrialism in New England, the birth of the textile mills. Specifically, what we're talking about here is an organization, an outfit called the Boston Manufacturing Company. The Boston Manufacturing Company set up a series of mills in New England, they were along the rivers, based principally on the idea that water power could move the mills. Water power ran the industry in the early 19th century. And the result was that much of this came from Great Britain. Many of the name that is often used in textbooks is Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater was from Rhode Island, and he spent a number of years in Great Britain. And he studied the mills there. He studied the factories and the textile mills that existed in Great Britain, and brought much of that knowledge back to the New World, back to the United States. Great Britain had laws which made it illegal to transport the kind of information which was privileged. And so, according to the studies, Slater committed an awful lot of this knowledge to memory. And when he came back to the United States, he sat down and began to write out from memory much of what he remembered about the way the mills were set up and organized, and these went into the development of the mills in New England, which ultimately led to what is usually referred to as the Boston Manufacturing Company, which was a major manufacturing operation in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is on the Merrimack River, about 40 miles north of Boston, right just south of the border with New Hampshire. Just south of the New Hampshire border is the town of Lowell. And the mills that were set up were along the Merrimack River, took advantage of the water power that was associated, that was used to generate electricity and move the mills, as it were. And there were an incredible number of jobs. And obviously, with the development of the textile industry in New England, there was a tremendous need for labor. And many companies, like the Boston Manufacturing Company, sent out scouts, front men who would go to European capitals and recruit labor, who talk people into leaving their homes in order to go across the ocean and move into New England in order to secure these jobs. There were jobs, there were opportunities in economic development in the world. And much of this was successful. But one of the most fascinating aspects of this is a phenomenon that is usually, if you look in the textbooks or go on the internet and Google the Lowell girls, Lowell, L-O-W-E-L-L, the Lowell girls, you will find a fascinating story about economic development and industrialism in New England during this period. And a lot of it is directly associated with the Boston Manufacturing Company and the development of the mills, first in the Merrimack River in Lowell, and then eventually a little bit inland in the area that is now called Waltham, Massachusetts. And the system that was set up by the manufacturing company and by the mills has come down to us as labeled as what is called the Waltham system. And I wanted to take a little bit of time to introduce you, if you haven't heard of this, if you remember your history from school, or, if college, if you remember American history in college, you may remember that in the chapters addressing the early 19th century in America, there is a section in there on the Waltham system, on the Boston manufacturing system, and the emergence of the textile mills in New England. And you may remember that this is the chapter in our textbooks. All of our textbooks are organized the same way. This would be the chapter in which the authors would address inventions. And one of the major inventions of this period was the invention of the cotton gin, Eli Whitney, 1793. And the whole idea of the introduction of interchangeable parts into American industry. And the combination of interchangeable parts and the development of the cotton gin, which made it possible to mass produce large amounts of cotton from the South. And that cotton would again make its way to the North and would feed these mills, these textile mills. And so in a sense, Southern agriculture, and I think this is important, Southern agriculture in the development of cotton after the cotton gin became as dependent on the New England mills, on the New England economy, as Southern agriculture had been on the British economy during the colonial period. I think this is an important phenomenon for all of us to think about and understand because it's very important. It's the idea of what I call, not just me, but what economists and historians refer to as the colonial economy, a colonial economy. The whole idea of a colonial economy is an economy overseas whose primary purpose is to produce the raw materials which allow industry to happen. Within the British framework of colonial America, as you know, there were New England colonies and there were the middle colonies and there were the southern colonies. Most textbooks break the 13 colonies down that way. And if you look at the British system of colonial management, which, for lack of a better term, is usually referred to as mercantilism, and I'd like to introduce that concept to you here, the idea of mercantilism. The British economy, Western economies during this period in the 17th and 18th century operated on the concept or the ideology of what is called mercantilism. The idea was that the economy was a planned, rational, regulated operation. Business was directly dependent on government, largesse. From the very beginning of capitalist development, mercantilism is, in effect, the first stages of what becomes capitalism. Mercantilism is the commercial stage. And once we get into the industrial period, then mercantilism becomes much more involved. And that's the period when mercantilism is under attack. That's the period when we get into the idea of free enterprise and the idea that we've got to get government out of the economy and let industry operate free and naturally as it should. And they use Adam Smith and his Wealth of Nations as justification for that. But the early stages of this is the commercial stage, and the commercial stage is referred to as mercantilism. And mercantilism is driven by or dominated by the relationship that exists between government and the middle class and the business community, the commercial community. The idea is that the development of the modern nation state, the modern nation in the West, Great Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany later on, Italy, etc., in the 19th century, the whole idea of the nation state is based on the idea of economic growth, of the pursuit of wealth. The whole rationale for establishing colonies and sending out explorers is to find wealth, to secure access to raw materials, to timber, iron ore, water. And in those areas of the colonial world where raw materials are not there naturally, then what you need to do is send large numbers of colonial citizens over to produce the wealth or grow the wealth. Within the British mercantile framework, the southern colonies in America, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, were ideal communities within the mercantile system of Great Britain. The reason is because their principal economy was colonial. Their principal job was the generation of raw materials to support the industrial development of the mother country at home. The southern economy was principally a plantation economy. In the 17th and 18th century, the principal product for export back to the mother country was tobacco. And the amount of tobacco that is generated from the Chesapeake, from Maryland and Virginia specifically, and then later on rice and indigo in the Carolinas, this allows Great Britain to economically dominate Europe in the early 18th century. And in the world wars that existed in the late 17th century, in the early 18th century, between France and Great Britain, ultimately with the end of the so-called 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War in 1763, Great Britain achieves dominance in the world. Great Britain effectively drives the French, for the most part, from Canada, and Canada becomes part of the British Empire in 1763. In the framework which we call mercantilism, the southern colonies were ideal because their whole economy was driven by the plantation system, which produced and transported tobacco and wheat and rice and indigo, those products that British merchants could use and transship. In other words, they would go directly to the mother country and then be transported from the mother country by British merchants throughout Europe. And the British economy dominated the world during this period. Much of the reason for it, because of the wealth that was being generated from Britain's New World colonies, not only the 13 colonies in North America, but also the Caribbean colonies, of Santo Domingo and all the rest of it, the wealth. And there's no question that the slave system, which was introduced primarily to support the production, the mass production of tobacco, the slave system was on its way out when Eli Whitney developed the cotton gin in 1793, which made it possible to reap tobacco in such quantities that Southern tobacco could feed the mills of New England. The fact of the matter is, whether Southern economy was feeding British manufacturing prior to 1776, or whether it was feeding New England manufacturing after the development of the Constitution and the emergence of the United States as a nation, the fact of the matter is the Southern economy remained colonial. It remained a producer of raw materials for the development of wealth that happened somewhere else. The whole idea of that, the idea of a colonial economy, is a support economy. It's not an independent, freestanding economy which allows production on its own. A colonial economy feeds manufacturing that happens elsewhere. From the British perspective, mercantile perspective, the New England economy became a competitor of the mother country because New England had its own merchants. New England was developing its own factories, its own development, its own economic capabilities. And so most of the problems that the mother country had with her New World colonies, primarily she had with New England, because New England from the very beginning was a competitor of the mother country rather than part of the empire designed to support the mother country. The Southern colonies were ideal. They were exactly what colonies were supposed to do, generate raw material and wealth to the mother country for the economic growth of the mother country and the benefit of the entire empire as a result. So I think the important thing, as we move towards the end of our program, we're at 54 minutes after. We only have 3 or 4 minutes left in today's program. The point that I would like to leave you with before we come back tomorrow and pick up on this story, the point that I would like to make and leave you with is the idea that the Southern economy, by definition, remains a colonial economy even after independence, even after the development of the Constitution. There's absolutely no question that part of the reason for what becomes secession of the South and the Civil War is the economic dependency of the Southern economy. And the idea being, in fact, many pro-Southern historians talk about the Civil War as the Second American Revolution. Because just as it was necessary for the 13 colonies to become independent from Great Britain in order to develop their own independent economy, so many people believe that Southern secession from the Union with the election of Abraham Lincoln was the South's effort to recreate the American War for Independence. That, in a sense, New England had kept the Southern economy dependent on it, just as Great Britain had kept the colonies themselves dependent on it. And just as the Patrick Henrys and the John Hancocks and the John Adamses and Sam Adamses and all the rest of the founders, just as the founders believed that in order to reach the full economic potential of America, it was necessary to sever the connection with Great Britain in order to break the bonds of what condemned the colonies to continue to be colonial economies. The South remained a colony. The difference is that it now was as dependent on New England as the South was during the colonial period on Great Britain. And from the very beginning, this sense of dependency, this colonialism, is a very, very important part of the story of Southern secession and the Civil War that follows. So I think that's a very, very important concept to kind of, bring our program today to a close, because I think it's very, very important. And what I want to do is develop the idea of the mills and the labor system that develops in the mills, because at the very beginning, the labor system where management exploits labor, the system that we associate with industrialism and that we know was not the system that the Boston Manufacturing Company adopted. The Waltham system and the young women who worked in the mills was a system exactly opposite to what ultimately became the exploitation of labor as part of the Industrial Revolution. That story, I think, is a fantastic part of American history, and it fits very well into our efforts to begin to expand on the idea of the virtual center for the study of the United States Constitution. We're at 2 minutes before the top of the hour, and I want to thank you all so much for listening, and I invite you to be back tomorrow for another edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution. I'm Bill O'Brien. I appreciate it so much. I look forward to tomorrow, as I hope you do as well. Please enjoy your evening, be safe, and we'll get back together again tomorrow. Have a good day. Again, be safe.